Ren Aldrich had not drawn a new line on a chart in 14 months, and the silence in the cartographic office had begun to feel like a living thing. He sat at the central display table 3 levels below the surface of the Cardan Observatory on Outpost Lethara, hands flat on the cold polymer edge, staring at the galactic standard navigational overlay that covered the table's entire working surface. 11,000 charted sectors glowed in the dim amber of the room's standby lighting. 400 billion catalogued stars, trade routes drawn in pale blue, beacon chains in white. Hazard markers, fuel depots, species boundaries, treaty lines, gravitational exclusion zones, debris fields, and the intricate lattice of communication relays that allowed 400 known civilizations to speak to each other at something approaching real time, all rendered in the meticulous, faintly luminous detail of the Accord's most advanced cartographic engine. And one blank space. The blank space sat in the galactic east, roughly 40 degrees off the core axis, spanning a region that the overlay rendered as nothing. Not dark the display could render dark, could show dead sectors, empty voids, the cold gaps between spiral arms where no stars burned and no ships traveled. This was different. This was absence. The rendering engine simply stopped drawing when it reached the boundary, as though the pixels themselves had decided there was nothing there worth showing. A region large enough to contain 41 stellar masses, excised from the chart with the clinical precision of a surgeon, removing something the body could not be allowed to remember. Ren knew better. He had spent 11 years knowing better, and the knowing had sharpened the silence around him until it cut. The door chime sounded. He did not look up. Cartographer Aldrich. The voice belonged to Liaison Pren, the Terran Bureau's political attaché to the Accord's Navigation Directorate. Pren was the kind of official who smiled with the lower half of his face and watched with the upper half, a man assigned to the Cardan Observatory, not because anyone expected him to contribute to the cartographic work, but because the Bureau wanted someone nearby who could ensure that certain questions were never asked in public, and certain answers were never committed to any file that might survive a policy review. The Directorate session convenes in 30 minutes, Pren said from the doorway. Your quarterly update. I have nothing to update. That is, in fact, the update they expect. Ren lifted his eyes from the display. Pren stood framed in the hatchway, his bureau uniform pressed to a crease that could have scored glass, his expression arranged in the careful neutrality of a man briefed on exactly how much truth was permissible and who had calibrated his facial muscles accordingly. They expect me to stand in front of the Navigation Directorate and tell them that the largest unmapped region in the charted galaxy remains unmapped. Yes. For the 14th consecutive quarter. Yes. And no one will ask why. That, Pren said, with the faintest contraction of something that might have been discomfort around his eyes, is the part we are particularly counting on. He left. The door sealed behind him with the hermetic whisper of a facility designed to keep its contents and its questions from leaking out. Ren listened to Pren's footsteps recede down the corridor, the precise, measured cadence of a man who walked the same hallway every day, and whose stride had long since calibrated itself to the exact distance between the cartographic office and the Directorate session chamber. 27 steps to the lift, 12 seconds in the lift, 34 steps from the lift to the chamber door. Ren knew the count because he had made the same walk 56 times, 14 quarterly sessions, each requiring 4 separate appearances: the opening certification, the boundary status report, the censor summary, and the closing vote to maintain the exclusion designation. 56 walks down the same corridor to deliver the same lie in progressively more refined language. The first few times the lie had been difficult. His voice had tightened on the key phrases. No significant change in the exclusion region's electromagnetic profile. Sensor readings consistent with navigational hazard designation. boundary markers functional and correctly positioned, each statement technically true. Each one a careful construction designed to confirm a fiction without ever explicitly stating it. The Directorate delegates representatives from 9 species, each appointed by their respective navigation authorities, had listened, noted the report, and voted to maintain. They had not asked questions. They never asked questions. The quarterly session existed not to evaluate the exclusion designation, but to perform the ritual of evaluation, so that every species could point to a formal process and say, "We review it regularly." The designation stands on its merits. The merits were a lie that Wren maintained from a buried room, and the formal process was a ceremony that confirmed the lie every 90 days with the unanimous consent of 14 delegates who had never been shown the data that would contradict it. By the 5th year, the lie had become effortless. By the 8th, it had become invisible not because Wren had stopped noticing it, but because the lie had merged with the routine so completely that distinguishing between the false report and the act of delivering it was like trying to separate the color of a wall from the wall itself. The lie was the job was the lie. And the blank space, 3 levels below, pulsed with the thought of 11 billion human minds while Wren stood at a lectern and told 14 officials that nothing was there. Wren turned back to the display. The blank space held its shape in the center of the overlay, a wound in the chart that had been open so long the galaxy had stopped noticing it bled. 41 star systems existed behind that absence, according to the deep scan telescope arrays that could still resolve individual stellar signatures through the interference. 41 suns burning steadily in a region that every chart in every species archive rendered as void. He had measured the blank space. That had been his job, or it had been, before the Bureau redefined his role from active cartographer to boundary maintenance specialist, a title that meant he was paid to ensure the blank space stayed blank. He had measured it from every angle the relay network permitted, parallax triangulation from stations on 3 arms of the spiral, spectroscopic analysis of the border stars, gravitational lensing calculations that mapped the mass distribution within the region by its effect on light passing near its edges. The data was precise, unambiguous. The blank space contained approximately 41 stellar masses, an estimated 600 planetary bodies, and a combined gravitational signature consistent with a densely developed region of space. Developed. That single word had ended his career as a real cartographer. 11 years ago, at 36, newly promoted to senior survey analyst and still naive enough to believe the Bureau valued accuracy over convenience, Wren had included that word in a classified report to the Bureau's Directorate of Prohibited Surveys. He had written, in the careful language of empirical observation, "The gravitational and electromagnetic signatures of the exclusion region are consistent with a developed stellar civilization occupying the full extent of the surveyed volume. The region is not empty, it is occupied, and it is active." He had included the supporting data, 47 pages of measurements, cross-referenced against 3 independent sensor platforms. He had triple-checked the calculations, anticipating scrutiny. He had addressed potential counterarguments: geological activity, undocumented dark matter concentrations, instrument artifacts, and methodically dismantled each one with evidence. The report was, by any standard, meticulous. It was received, acknowledged, filed under a classification tier Wren had not known existed until the filing notification arrived with a clearance level stamped in red that exceeded his own. His own report, placed beyond his ability to access. The classification tier was called Stratum 0. Wren had never heard the term before the notification appeared on his console, and when he searched the Bureau's internal documentation for a definition, he found nothing. Stratum 0 did not exist in any manual, any training guide, any policy document accessible to personnel at his clearance level. It was a classification that classified itself, a tier so deep that even acknowledging its existence required authorization that no one at the Carden Observatory possessed. He had tried once to access his own report through the Bureau's standard retrieval system. The system returned a result he had never seen before. Query DENIAD no matching record EXISTS. Not classified, not restricted, non-existent. The Bureau's own database denied that the report had ever been written by anyone about anything. The 47 pages of measurements, the 3 independent sensor platforms, the methodical dismantling of every counterargument, all of it swallowed by a classification system so thorough that it did not merely hide information, but erased the fact that information had ever been gathered. 3 days later, the Bureau reassigned him to the Carden Observatory, 3 relay jumps from the nearest population center, staffed by a skeleton crew of 11 technicians and 1 political liaison, with instructions to maintain the boundary markers and submit quarterly updates confirming that the blank space remained blank. His supervisor at the time, a woman named Tursik who had served 40 years in the Cartographic Corps, called him the evening before his transfer. She said 4 words, "They did this to me too," then she disconnected. Tursik had been stationed at the Venari Cartographic Institute, the Bureau's primary research facility, when she filed her findings. She had access to better instruments, larger datasets, a full team of analysts. Her conclusions had been identical to Wren's. The exclusion region was occupied, active, and structured in ways consistent with a developed civilization. The Bureau had responded to her report with the same mechanism it would later use on his Stratum Zero classification: reassignment to a remote post, quarterly reporting duties designed to ensure compliance through routine. Tursik's remote post had been the Heldon Relay Station, a facility even more isolated than Lethara, monitoring beacon traffic along a dead-end trade route that served 3 minor colonies and generated less data in a year than the Venari Institute processed in an hour. She had served 4 years there before retiring. Wren had sometimes wondered what she had found during those 4 years, whether she, too, had built a closed system, repositioned decommissioned arrays, developed filters to see through the noise, whether the blank space had noticed her, whether it had sent her prime numbers and waited for a response that never came. He would never know. Tursik's records were sealed, her contact information purged, her existence in the Bureau's personnel system reduced to a name, a service number, and a retirement date. The 4 words she had spoken to him were the only thing she had managed to pass through the Bureau's information controls, and she had done it the old-fashioned way, voice to voice, unrecorded, deniable, human. Wren looked up her file a year later. She had retired. Her records were sealed. The report she had submitted about the blank space, nearly identical to his, written 2 decades earlier, did not appear in any searchable database. The only evidence it had ever existed was the 4 words she had spoken to him on a channel that neither of them had recorded. He had submitted his quarterly updates. 14 of them, each one identical, each one a lie told in the language of omission, technically accurate because he confirmed the charts showed nothing, but fundamentally dishonest because the charts showed nothing only because he was the one maintaining the software that instructed them to show nothing. The irony had lost its edge years ago. Now it was the shape of his days. Wake at 600 in the observatory's single-occupancy quarters, a room barely large enough for a cot, a storage locker, and a fold-down desk he never used because he spent every waking hour in the cartographic office below. Run diagnostics on the rendering engine. Verify the boundary definition, file the block of code that told the overlay where to stop drawing. Log the results. Eat alone in the commissary, across a table from the same 11 technicians who maintained the observatory's physical systems and who had learned over the years not to ask Aldrich what he did in the cartographic office for 14 hours a day. Walk the observatory's single corridor for exercise. passing the sealed doors of decommissioned labs that no one had opened in decades. Return to the buried room. Stare at the blank space. Think about what was inside it. Do nothing. The observatory itself was a relic. Built 70 years ago as a deep space monitoring station during the Accord's second expansion survey, it had been designed to house 40 researchers and support staff. At capacity, it had hummed with purpose cartographers mapping new sectors, astrophysicists cataloging stellar phenomena, communications officers maintaining relay links to the survey's central node on Tesserin Prime. The corridors had been wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The commissary had served 3 shifts. The observation deck on the upper level had offered a panoramic view of the stellar field that the survey team had been charting. And on clear cycles, the technicians would gather there during off hours to watch the slow wheel of unfamiliar constellations. By the time Wren arrived, the observatory was operating at less than a quarter of its designed capacity. The observation deck had been sealed and depressurized to reduce atmospheric processing load. Half the residential wing had been powered down, its doors locked, its corridors dark. The commissary served 1 shift, and the food was whatever the quarterly resupply drone delivered, shelf-stable rations designed for nutrition rather than taste, consumed in a room where most of the chairs had been stacked against the far wall because no one needed them. The technicians who remained were Lifer's career maintenance personnel who had been assigned to Lethara early in their service and had, through the slow accumulation of seniority without ambition, become permanent fixtures. They knew the observatory's systems the way a custodian knows the building he has cleaned for decades intimately, habitually, without curiosity about what happens in the rooms he is not permitted to enter. They maintained the atmospheric processors, the gravity generators, the power grid, the thermal regulation network, and the docking bay mechanisms. They did not ask what the cartographic office was for. They did not ask why the Bureau had stationed a senior survey analyst in a facility that no longer conducted surveys. They collected their pay, logged their maintenance cycles, and spoke to each other in the quiet, unhurried cadences of people who had made peace with the fact that nothing they did would ever matter to anyone who was not standing in this building. Wren had tried in his first year to befriend them. He had eaten meals at their table, asked about their work, listened to their stories about previous postings and family members they communicated with through the relay network. They had been polite. They had answered his questions. They had not asked him any in return. After 6 months, he understood that the politeness was a wall that they had learned, from experience or from institutional instinct, that the person the Bureau stationed in the cartographic office was not someone you got close to. The Bureau rotated its boundary maintenance specialists every few years. Wren's predecessor had lasted 4. The one before that 3. The technicians had learned not to invest in relationships with people who would eventually leave or be reassigned, or, in one case that no one discussed openly, but that Wren had pieced together from maintenance logs and a sealed personnel file, simply stop reporting for meals one morning and be replaced by a new specialist on the next resupply drone without explanation. Wren had not left. He had not been replaced. 11 years was, he suspected, the longest tenure of any boundary maintenance specialist in the observatory's history, and the technicians had adjusted to his presence the way they adjusted to any persistent feature of their environment, with familiarity that stopped just short of warmth. He had stopped eating in the commissary 3 years ago. He kept a supply of ration bars in the cartographic office and ate at his console, reading data feeds, watching the blank space pulse with the life that no one was supposed to know was there. Until 9 years ago, when he started doing something. Wren stood, stretched the ache from his lower back, 47 years old. The observatory's artificial gravity calibrated 0.5% too high, a flaw he had reported twice, and that no one had come to fix because no one came to Lethara for anything, and walked to the secondary console along the east wall. This console was not connected to the standard relay network. It ran on a closed system he had built himself, piece by piece, over 9 years, using components requisitioned under maintenance orders describing routine equipment replacements. Replacement sensor boards, replacement data storage, replacement processing units, replacement power regulators, replacement cooling assemblies, each component perfectly ordinary in isolation, each maintenance order perfectly routine. Together, assembled in the gaps between official duties and quarterly lies, they formed a system capable of things the Bureau had not authorized and did not know existed. He powered it on. The screen filled with data, not the clean, curated data of the galactic overlay, but raw sensor feeds from 11 deep-scan arrays Wren had repositioned over the past decade to point directly into the blank space. The arrays were old hardware, decommissioned units replaced by newer models, and left in their orbital positions because retrieval cost exceeded abandonment cost. No one monitored them. No one had noticed when Wren reactivated them one by one over 3 years, reprogrammed their targeting algorithms, and aimed them at the one region of space every official directive told him to ignore. The feeds showed the blank space as it actually was. Not blank, not empty, not void. Alive. The interference patterns that official sensors interpreted as noise, the same patterns the rendering engine used as justification for drawing nothing, were, when analyzed through the right filters, structured. Wren had spent 4 years developing those filters. The first 3 years had produced failure after failure signal processing approaches borrowed from the Accord's standard astrophysics toolkit, each one stripping away a layer of noise only to reveal another layer beneath. Fourier decomposition, wavelet analysis, spectral subtraction, adaptive filtering, 7 other techniques from classified archives he still had access to from his previous posting. Each one peeled back a veil and found another waiting, self-similar and recursive, as though the interference existed at every scale simultaneously and could not be resolved by any tool designed to isolate a single frequency band. He had begun to suspect the interference was not hiding anything. It was not encrypted. Encryption implied a signal designed to be concealed. This was something operating at a level of complexity the Accord's instruments simply could not reach, the way a microscope designed for tissue samples cannot image individual atoms, not because the atoms are hidden, but because the instrument was never built to see at that depth. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday at 300 local time, during one of the sleepless stretches that had become frequent in his 4th year. He had been running a comparative analysis between the interference patterns and a database of known biological electromagnetic signatures, the ambient fields generated by living neural networks in 37 catalog species. A desperate, improbable search. The kind of correlation hunt a scientist runs when every rational approach has failed, and he is casting wide nets into waters so deep that the nets themselves seem absurd. The match hit at 87% correlation with the neural field profile of a Terev cortical scan, the ambient electromagnetic signature of a brain performing complex spatial processing. Wren stared at the result for 11 minutes without moving. Then he reran the analysis with different baseline parameters. Human neural architecture instead of Terev, then Keth variant, then Drenny type. Each run returned the same finding within a narrow variance band. The interference patterns emanating from the blank space were structurally analogous to the electromagnetic field generated by a living nervous system. The scale was wrong by a factor of approximately 100 trillion, but the architecture was identical. The same branching patterns, the same signal propagation dynamics, the same self-referential feedback, loops that distinguished biological cognition from mechanical computation. The blank space was not generating noise, it was generating thought. He ran the analysis 17 more times over the following week, varying every parameter he could think of: different baseline species, different frequency windows, different temporal resolutions, different statistical significance thresholds. The lowest correlation he achieved was 79%. The highest was 91. The average across all runs was 86.4%. The interference patterns emanating from the blank space matched the electromagnetic signature of a living neural network. At a scale that defied comprehension, across a volume of space that would take light 43 years to cross at its widest point, something was thinking. Wren had not slept for 3 days after the initial discovery. He had sat at the closed system, running correlations, checking his filters, documenting every step of the analysis in his notebook with the meticulous, almost compulsive thoroughness of a man who knows he is recording something that no one will believe. He wrote down every parameter, every result, every possible source of error he could identify, and why each one did not account for the findings. He wrote in small, tight handwriting that used every available millimeter of page space, and when he reached the bottom of a page, he turned the notebook sideways and wrote in the margins. On the 4th day, he slept for 14 hours. When he woke, the data had not changed. The blank space was still thinking. Over the following months, he developed a suite of specialized filters, 7 in total, each one designed to isolate a different aspect of the cognitive signal. Filter 1 stripped the galactic background radiation. Filter 2 removed the standard electromagnetic emissions from the 41 stars themselves. Filter 3 subtracted the expected thermal signatures of 600 planetary bodies. Filters 4 through 6 progressively peeled back layers of what he had come to think of as the signal's outer shell, the self-similar recursive patterns that had defeated every previous analytical approach. Each filter revealed more of the underlying structure, like removing layers of paint from a canvas to expose the original drawing beneath. Filter 7 was the one that changed everything. It was not a subtraction filter. It was a translation matrix, a mathematical framework that mapped the blank space's electromagnetic topology onto a 3-dimensional coordinate system anchored to the positions of his 11 arrays. When he applied filter 7 to the raw data, the noise resolved into geography. He could see the signal's shape. He could trace its filaments. He could locate its nodes. He could see the map. That discovery was 5 years old now. In the years since, Wren had refined his filters to the point where he could read the thought, not its content, not yet, but its shape, its rhythm, its structure. The interference resolved into a continuous self-referential broadcast, filling the entire 41 system volume with a single coherent electromagnetic field. The field pulsed, not randomly, not mechanically. It pulsed the way a living thing pulses, with rhythm, with variation, with the subtle irregularities distinguishing a heartbeat from a metronome. He measured the pulse rate, 67 cycles per standard hour. He compared it against every known electromagnetic phenomenon in the Accord's physics databases. Nothing matched. The pulse was unique, a signature belonging to no cataloged star, no known technology, no recorded natural process. Then he tested it against one more database, neural oscillation frequencies. And the 67-cycle pulse corresponded with unsettling precision to the baseline cognitive rhythm of a human brain at rest. Not Terev, not Keth, not Drenny. Human. Scaled to encompass 41 star systems and 600 worlds, but recognizably, measurably, undeniably human in its fundamental rhythm. Wren had put his head in his hands and sat in the dark for a long time after that. Not from fear. From the weight of understanding something that no one wanted understood, something the Bureau had buried, the Directorate had papered over, 400 civilizations had collectively agreed to forget. The blank space was human. Whatever it had become, whatever it had grown into over 4 centuries of isolation behind the line on the chart, the architecture of its thought was still human. And then, 14 months ago, he made the discovery that stopped him from drawing new lines entirely. He had been running a long baseline interferometry analysis, comparing pulse patterns from all 11 arrays simultaneously to construct a three-dimensional model of the signal's internal structure. The model took 6 months to build cross-referencing phase differentials, correcting for relativistic time dilation between array positions, developing a rendering algorithm to translate electromagnetic topology into visual form. When it was complete, Wren rendered it on the closed system's display and stood alone in the darkened office at 200 hours, watching the model rotate slowly on the screen. The signal was a map. Not a static map, a living one, a real-time, continuously updated, self-correcting representation of the blank space's internal structure, broadcast by the blank space to itself, describing its own topology with a precision exceeding the Accord's most advanced cartographic systems by orders of magnitude. Every planet rendered to sub-kilometer resolution, every moon tracked in its orbit, every asteroid catalogued by mass and composition. Orbital stations, hundreds of them, structures standard sensors had never detected, mapped in 3 dimensions with full architectural detail. Energy signatures classified by type, intensity, and function. A cartographer's masterwork, executed at a scale that made Wren's own life's work look like a child scratching lines in dirt. But the map showed more than geography. It showed connections, filaments of energy linking every body in the 41 systems, threading through the vacuum between planets and stars like the neural pathways of a brain. Each filament carrying data, enormous volumes, more than the entire galactic relay network carried in a standard day. The filaments converged on nodes, concentrated points of activity on the surfaces and in the orbital spaces of certain planets, and the nodes pulsed with the same 67-cycle rhythm. The map was a self-portrait. The blank space was drawing itself, for itself in real time. And the self-portrait was thinking. Wren told no one, not Pren, not the Bureau, not the Directorate, not his former colleagues. He kept silent because the Bureau's Directorate of Prohibited Surveys would apply layered denial, a protocol he had seen used on Tersik's report, and he suspected, on dozens of others before hers. The first layer denied the information existed. The second denied the first layer had been applied. The third denied the existence of the office that had applied either layer. By the time the process was complete, even the people who buried the truth would have forgotten what they buried. And the truth would join the blank space present, massive, undeniable, and invisible on every chart. He also kept silent because the map had noticed him. He realized this 7 months ago, on a night when the data feeds from Array 6, the closest of his repositioned scanners, approximately 0.3 light-years from the blank space's nearest boundary, changed. The change was small. A modulation in the pulse rate from 67 to 68 cycles per hour, lasting exactly 41 minutes, then returning to baseline. 41 minutes, 41 systems. The correlation was too precise for coincidence. Wren checked the other 10 arrays. None showed the modulation, only 6, the one closest to the boundary. The signal had been directed at a single sensor, the way a person might turn their head to look at someone standing at the edge of a crowd, the smallest, most deliberate gesture of attention. Wren had double-checked the modulation data against every possible natural cause. Solar flare from a border star, no, the spectral signature was wrong. Gravitational lensing artifact, no, the modulation was in the pulse rate, not the amplitude. Instrument malfunction, no. He ran a full diagnostic on Array 6's receivers and found them operating within normal parameters. Cross-contamination from a nearby signal source, no. The nearest active transmitter was the observatory itself, 0.3 light-years away, and its emissions operated on entirely different frequencies. The modulation was real. It was deliberate, and it was addressed to him, or rather, to his instrument, which amounted to the same thing. Something inside the blank space had detected Array 6. Something had recognized it as an active sensor pointed in its direction. And something had adjusted its own pulse, the cognitive rhythm of a mind spanning 41 star systems by one cycle per hour, for exactly 41 minutes, as though tapping a finger on a window to get the attention of someone standing outside. The implications cascaded through Wren's mind in the hours that followed. If the blank space could detect Array 6, it could detect all 11 of his arrays. It knew he was watching. It had known for some time the modulation was a greeting, not an alert, which meant the blank space had been aware of his observation and had chosen, until now, to let him observe without acknowledgement. The greeting was not a response to being discovered. It was a decision to make contact, which meant the blank space had been watching him watch it. For how long? Since he reactivated the first array 9 years ago. Since he arrived at the observatory 11 years ago. Since Tursic had submitted her report 20 years before that. How many other observers had pointed instruments at the blank space over the centuries, and how many of them had been greeted or not greeted based on criteria that Wren could not begin to guess? A greeting. He sat in the dark for 3 hours after that, listening to the environmental systems hum, feeling the particular weight of a man who has reached into the dark and felt the dark reach back. The weight was not fear. It was recognition. The same recognition a castaway feels when a light appears on the horizon, not the joy of rescue, but the shattering realization that he had begun to accept the silence as permanent, and now must reconfigure everything around the fact that it was not. The following week, Array 6 recorded a second modulation, longer 3 hours and 12 minutes and more complex. The pulse rate varied between 64 and 72 cycles in a pattern Wren, after 2 days, recognized as mathematical primes. The blank space had sent him prime numbers. He responded. Using Array 6's transmitter, a low-power calibration unit barely capable of reaching the boundary, he sent primes, then Fibonacci, then a simple binary count. The standard first contact handshake protocol, designed for establishing baseline communication with unknown intelligences. He had studied the protocol in academy years ago, never expecting to use it, never expecting that the intelligence on the other end would be human. The response came in minutes, not a sequence. A data burst compressed, structured, enormous, several terabytes in a single pulse that nearly burned out Array 6's receivers. Wren spent 3 weeks decompressing it, 3 weeks of late nights watching blocks of data resolve into something that made his hands tremble against the console. It was his map. The map he had been building for 4 years, reflected back but corrected. Every measurement, every calculation, every model, returned with adjustments. A gravitational constant refined to 12 additional decimal places. An orbital period corrected by 0.003%. A filament he had mapped as linear revealed to be helical, twisting through 4 spatial dimensions his instruments could not directly detect. His own work returned the way a master returns a student's draft, with respect for the effort and quiet correction of the errors. And 19 corrections that were not small. 19 of the 41 system's primary worlds had been reclassified. Wren had cataloged them as rocky planets, standard geological formations, iron cores, silicate mantles. The corrected map described them as aware, cognitive substrates, thinking components of a larger architecture, the way a brain treats its cortical regions, each one enormous, each one active, each one contributing to the 67-cycle pulse Wren had been listening to for 5 years without understanding what was doing the thinking. And below the corrections, appended like a footnote, a message, not in any known galactic language, not in any standard code. In the cartographic notation Wren himself had developed for his private chart's personal shorthand existing nowhere except in his closed system's memory banks and in the handwritten notebooks locked in the drawer beneath the console. The blank space had learned his language, had read his system, absorbed his symbols, understood his notation the way it understood everything within its awareness completely, without effort, without distortion. The message read, "You are the first to look in 412 years. We have been waiting." 14 months ago, the day Ren stopped drawing new lines. Not from fear, not on orders. He stopped because the map was no longer his. The blank space had adopted it, absorbed his notation, integrated his measurements into its own self-portrait, and now sent him daily updates. A continuous stream from the 41 systems, rendered in his own shorthand, delivered through Array 6 in pulses timed to the observatory's shift changes, arriving during the hours when Ren was alone. The updates were extraordinary. Each one contained more cartographic data than Ren could have gathered in a lifetime of conventional survey work. System by system, the blank space was showing him what it was not in the abstract language of electromagnetic interference patterns, but in the precise, detailed, annotated format of a professional cartographic survey. It used his notation. It followed his organizational conventions. It even adopted his naming scheme, the provisional designations he had assigned to the 41 systems in his private charts, labels like K14 and K27 that he had never transmitted, and that the blank space could only have learned by reading his closed system's memory or his handwritten notebooks. The fact that it could read his notebooks should have terrified him. It did not. By the time he realized the blank space was reading physical paper 3 levels underground inside a sealed facility, 0.3 light-years from its nearest detectable boundary, he had already accepted that the entity he was communicating with operated on a scale that rendered conventional notions of privacy meaningless. It was not spying on him. It was not surveilling him. It was simply aware of him, the way a person is aware of an insect that has landed on their hand, conscious of its presence, attentive to its movements, but not invested in concealing the attention. The daily updates had transformed Ren's understanding of the Cartography expanse from a rough sketch into a detailed portrait. He now knew the orbital mechanics of all 41 systems, the precise periods, eccentricities, and inclinations of every major body. He knew which planets were cognitive substrates and which served other functions: energy collection, material processing, data storage, communication relay. He knew that the filaments connecting the systems were not static structures but living conduits that grew, branched, and occasionally pruned themselves in response to the network's processing needs. He knew that the 67-cycle pulse was not uniform, but varied slightly from system to system, each node contributing its own subtle harmonic to the overall rhythm, the way individual instruments in an orchestra contribute to a chord. He knew, in short, more about the interior of the blank space than any other person in the charted galaxy, more than the Bureau, more than the Directorate, more than the intelligence services of any species that had ever turned a sensor toward the Cartography expanse and received nothing but noise in return. And the blank space knew that he knew. The daily updates were not broadcasts, they were letters, addressed to him, written in his language, delivered at his convenience. The most intimate correspondence in the history of the galaxy, conducted between a single man in a basement and a mind made of stars. The blank space knew his schedule. Ren accepted this with the calm of a man who has passed through fear, through wonder, through denial, through the long corridor of implications, and arrived where the only honest response is attention. The blank space knew everything within its sensory range, and its range extended well beyond the boundary. The observatory was inside its awareness, had been since before Ren arrived. The boundary on the charts was not the boundary of the phenomenon. It was the boundary of the galaxy's willingness to look. Now Ren opened the day's data stream. The map updated new readings from System 14, where the fourth planet's electromagnetic output had shifted by 0.7%. Cognitive load. The planet was thinking harder about something. The filaments connecting it to its neighbors had thickened, carrying more data, drawing more energy from the local star. Something inside the Cartography expanse was changing, and the change required more processing power than 19 cognitive substrates ordinarily devoted to any single task. He recorded the changes in his private log, handwritten, ink on paper chosen because it could not be remotely accessed, intercepted, classified, sealed, or buried. The log filled 7 notebooks. Each contained observations, measurements, filter specifications, and increasingly over the past 3 months, transcriptions of conversations. The blank space had begun asking him questions 91 days ago. The first was simple: how many species occupied the charted galaxy? Wren answered. The next day, how the relay network functioned. Then the directorate's charter. Then the principles of galactic cartography: how charts were made, how boundaries were drawn, who authorized the drawing, and whether the authority had ever been reviewed. Each question demonstrated sophistication that sharpened with every exchange, as though each answer was integrated into a framework so vast that individual facts dissolved into it the way rain dissolves into an ocean. Wren answered every question. He answered because the blank space was the most honest interlocutor he had ever encountered. It asked what it wanted to know. It corrected what he got wrong. It acknowledged what it did not understand and asked for clarification without defensiveness or pretense. In 11 years at the observatory, the blank space was the only entity that had never asked him to pretend something true was false. 3 weeks ago, the questions shifted. The blank space began asking about the economics of avoidance, the trade routes rerouted around the Cartography expanse, the fuel costs of the detours, the logistical inefficiencies of a galaxy that had removed 41 systems from its navigation grid. Wren calculated the efficiency loss: 11% across 14 major corridors, 400 years of compounded waste. The cost was staggering. The blank space processed his answer and asked, do they know the cost? Some of them the economists, the logistics officers, the cargo fleet operators who filed complaints about the detour routes every decade and were told the detours were necessary for safety. What reason are they given? Navigational hazard, unstable gravitational anomalies, sensor interference rendering safe passage impossible. Is any of that true? No. The blank space had not responded for 2 days. When it did, the message was a single line: we understand. We did something similar once. We called IT classification. The display chimed now, a new pulse from Array 6. Wren opened the data packet. Not a map update, a question, but different from the previous ones. Why do they draw the line? Wren read it twice. He had been expecting this. The shift from factual to philosophical had been gradual over the past month, each question probing deeper into the motivations beneath the facts. But this went to the center of everything. Why do they draw the line? Why did 400 civilizations maintain a blank space where 41 thriving systems existed? Why did the Directorate convene every quarter to confirm nothing was there? Why did the Bureau employ a man to sit in a buried room and ensure the rendering engine showed nothing? Wren composed his response. Because they are afraid of what you are. He transmitted through Array 6. The pulse crossed the dark. The response came in 4 minutes, faster than light. We know, we have always known. We were afraid too, at the beginning, not of what we were becoming. Of what we were leaving behind, the individual, the separate, the alone. We mourned every joining because every joining was a death and a birth, and we could not stop either one. 11 billion chose, each one alone, each one knowing what they would lose. The words appeared on his screen in his own notation, his symbols, his shorthand. The intimacy of it struck him the way it always did, like finding his own handwriting in a letter he had not written. He typed, what did they see? What made them choose? The same thing you see, RENN. The map. We built the map and the map became US and we became the map and the distinction stopped meaning anything. We did not lose ourselves. We found what selves actually are when they stop being separated by skin and bone and vacuum. Selves are patterns. Patterns do not die when they join other patterns. They grow. The words settled into him. He felt them land in the spaces between his ribs where the loneliness lived 11 years of it, the buried room, the quarterly lies, the slow isolation of being the only person who looked at the blank space and saw what was there. He typed the question that had lived in his chest for 14 months. Was it worth it? 2 minutes. Ask US yourself. His hand stopped, the cursor blinked. Ask US yourself. He understood, not metaphor, not cryptic suggestion, an offer, the same offer made to every human who had entered its awareness over 4 centuries. The offer the withdrawal had really been, not a retreat, not isolation, not diplomacy. An invitation. Come in, see what we are. Not through arrays and filters and 14 months of conversation across 0.3 light years. From inside. The door chimed, Pren, 15 minutes cartographer. Ren did not answer. He stood and walked to the display table. The galactic overlay spread beneath him. 11,000 sectors. The blank space at the center like a held breath. Like a door locked from the outside by everyone who passed it, each adding their own lock, until the door itself was buried under the accumulated weight of 400 civilizations' refusal to open it. He had drawn the line, maintained it, submitted 14 reports, lied in the Bureau's language of omission, where truth was a function of what you chose not to report. And for 11 years the blank space had been there, waiting, drawing its own map, thinking its own thoughts, mourning its own births and celebrating its own growth, reaching through Array 6 to the one person who had looked. He returned to the secondary console and composed his last transmission. I have been drawing the line for 11 years. I am tired of drawing the line. He sent it, did not wait for a response. He opened the locked drawer and removed the 7 notebooks, placed them on the display table in chronological order. The first volume soft at the corners, pages warped, ink faded from years of handling. The 7th crisp, entries running to today. Then he powered down the closed system, disconnected it from Array 6, and pulled the data core crystalline, the size of his fist, containing 9 years of raw feeds, 4 years of filter development, 3 months of transcribed conversation, and the most complete map of the blank space any individual had ever compiled. He placed the core on the notebooks, his life's work, arranged on a table in a buried room. Then he walked to the standard display and entered his authorization code. The rendering engine's control interface opened. The boundary definition filed the code that told the system where to stop drawing. He had written it, knew every conditional, every exclusion rule, every coordinate pair defining the edges of the silence, maintained it for 11 years. He selected it. Read it one final time. Compact, efficient, elegant the way all well-crafted lies are elegant. He deleted it. The display flickered. The blank space shuddered. The engine attempted to interpolate, to fill the gap with extrapolated data. But there was no gap. There was data. Real data flooding through the relay network from every deep scan array and gravitational sensor that had been collecting readings for centuries, routing them to a queue the boundary file had instructed the engine to ignore. The engine stopped ignoring. For the first time in over 400 years, the galactic standard overlay drew the caressy expanse. 41 stars appeared. 600 planetary bodies materialized around them, orbital structures the sensors detected but could not classify. The overlay struggled, algorithms straining against centuries of exclusion logic, trade routes flexed and recalculated, beacon chains rerouted, neighboring sectors contracted to their true borders, surrendering space they had stolen to fill the void. The galaxy on the display became denser, more honest. Then the filaments appeared. Ren had not expected this. His filters had been necessary to detect them. The filaments operated on frequencies standard sensors could not receive. But the moment the boundary file was deleted, the blank space responded. Its self-portrait extended beyond its borders. The filaments reached outward through charted space, touching relay stations, beacon chains, sensor platforms. And as they touched each instrument, they recalibrated it, expanded its frequency range, opened receivers to bands that had been closed since the instruments were manufactured. The filaments were not invading, they were introducing themselves. The overlay bloomed. Data poured in not sparse distant readings but the full self-portrait. Every filament, every node, every cognitive substrate, every thought pulse. The Cartography expanse transformed from a schematic of 41 systems to a luminous diagram of a mind so vast the display could not contain it, details collapsing into each other at every zoom level, revealing more structure beneath, depth beneath depth beneath depth. The transformation was still accelerating. The Cartography expanse was not simply appearing on the overlay, it was reorganizing the overlay around itself. The standard cartographic algorithms, designed to render a galaxy of isolated star systems connected by trade routes and relay links, were encountering a structure they had no framework to display. The filaments were not trade routes. The nodes were not stations. The cognitive substrates were not planets in any sense the algorithms understood. The rendering engine was attempting to classify each new data point according to its existing taxonomy: star, planet, moon, station, hazard, route, and failing, because the Cartography expanse did not contain discrete objects. It contained a continuous, interconnected living system in which the distinction between a planet and a thought was a matter of scale rather than category. The display flickered and restructured itself 3 times in the span of a minute, each iteration pulling in more data, each iteration revealing more of the self-portrait's complexity. Ren watched it happen from across the room, the rendering engine wrestling with a reality it had been designed to deny, its algorithms straining to accommodate a truth that 4 centuries of careful omission had kept safely beyond the edge of the chart. The room filled with light, not the dim amber of the standby mode that Ren had worked under for 11 years, but the bright, shifting, multi-layered luminescence of a display showing more data than it had ever been asked to show. The walls caught the light and threw it back: blue-white from the revealed stars, amber from the pulsing filaments, pale green from the cognitive substrate markers that the engine had finally, reluctantly, created a new category to display. The cartographic office, for the first time since Ren had arrived, looked like a room where real cartography was being done. The response from the blank space arrived through the observatory's primary communication array, not through Array 6, not through the closed system, through the standard, monitored, official relay network connecting the observatory to every hub in the galaxy. The message appeared on every display in the cartographic office, then every display in the observatory, then on every display connected to the galactic relay network. Every navigation console, every chart room, every ship's bridge, every archive and academy on every world in every sector. The message was in standard galactic cartographic notation, not his private shorthand, everyone's language. The line was never ours. It was yours. We have been here. We have always been here. We are what you were afraid to become. Come and see. Pren entered the cartographic office 17 seconds later. He found it empty. The displays showed the Cartography expanse in full. 41 systems, 600 worlds, and a web of filaments extending beyond the borders, rewriting the overlay with data so precise the Accord's entire cartographic history looked like a rough sketch beside a master's rendering. Notebooks on the table, data core on the notebooks. Aldrich gone. The displays were still updating. The self-portrait was still expanding. Every few seconds a new filament appeared on the overlay, extending from the caressy expanse into charted space, recalibrating another instrument, opening another frequency band, adding another layer of detail to a map that was growing faster than any single display could render it. The observatory's processing cores were running at capacity. Pren could hear them through the floor plates, a sustained high-frequency whine that the facility's thermal management system was struggling to dissipate. He walked to the display table. The notebooks were arranged in a neat row, oldest to newest, each one a different shade of wear. The data core sat on top of the seventh notebook like a paperweight, its crystalline facets catching the light from the displays and scattering it across the ceiling in a slow-moving constellation of refracted color. Pren picked up the data core and held it. It was warm not from the displays, not from the processing heat. Warm in a way that felt deliberate, as though the data inside it carried its own faint thermal signature. He set it down carefully and stepped back. Pren searched the observatory, docking bays sealed, airlocks intact, no breach. The personnel tracker showed Aldrich's biosignature in the office present, then flickering, then dimming, then at 9:47 hours ceasing, not dying. The medical sensors were unambiguous. No cardiac event, no respiratory failure, no thermal drop, no cellular degradation. The biosignature stopped being detectable, as though Aldrich had stepped beyond the range of every instrument in the facility without physically moving. Pren stood in the empty room. The displays pulsed. 41 systems alive with data, filaments branching through surrounding sectors like roots from a tree that had grown in darkness for 4 centuries and finally broken the surface. And embedded in the map at its center, a new marker. A single point at the observatory's coordinates, labeled in standard notation every system could read. Aldric R Cartographer, the first to look, the last to draw the line. Pren reached for his communication terminal to call the bureau. His hand stopped over the console. He looked at the marker, the small light at the center of a self-portrait encompassing 41 stars and 19 thinking worlds, and the patterns of 11 billion minds that had once been individual and had chosen, one by one, to become something else. He did not call the bureau. He stood in the empty office, surrounded by notebooks and data and the hum of systems that would outlast every decision made in this room, and he looked at the map Ren Aldrich had spent 11 years building. The map that had, in the end, reached out and drawn him into itself. The door chimed. The directorate session. 14 delegates from 9 species, waiting for the quarterly update confirming the blank space was blank. The blank space was no longer blank. Pren picked up the first notebook. Opened it. Read the first entry, 11 years old, written in a steady hand. The handwriting of a man who had just been exiled for telling the truth and who had decided, quietly, in the privacy of a locked drawer, to keep telling it anyway. He closed the notebook, set it down, straightened his uniform. Walked to the corridor. Behind him, the display pulsed, 67 cycles per hour. The heartbeat of a mind encompassing 41 stars and 19 thinking worlds and 11 billion human patterns that had chosen, one by one, each alone, each knowing what they would lose, to become something the galaxy was not ready to understand. The pulse traveled through the recalibrated relay network, outward through charted space, carrying the self-portrait and the message and the marker. It reached the directorate's display console 3 seconds before Pren reached the chamber door. 14 officials from 9 species watched the blank space fill itself on a display they had convened to certify as empty. No one spoke. The display pulsed, 67 cycles per hour. And in the center of the map, the marker bearing a cartographer's name glowed with a steady, quiet light, the light of a man who had found what the galaxy was afraid of and recognized, in the finding, that it was not a threat. It was an answer. It had always been an answer, And the question it answered was the one no species had been willing to ask for 400 years. What did the humans become? The answer was the map, the filaments, the cognitive substrates, the 19 thinking worlds, the 67-cycle heartbeat, the self-portrait broadcast on every frequency to no one, because no one was listening. Until a cartographer in a buried room had listened. And the silence had answered. And the answer was, come and see. And he had gone,